Okay, good evening. It is, I've no idea what the date is. I think it's the 24th of November. We have Craig Gumbley from Extrovert on the line to talk about VCP6-CMA Objective 4, which is all about administering tenants and business groups. So without any further ado, I'm going to let Craig carry on with that. If you do have any questions, then use the GoToWebinar app to raise your hand, or use the vBrownBag hashtag in Twitter. We get the questions asked. But other than that, I'm going to pass it over to Craig.
Okay, right then, let's get started. I just want to say, if anyone has any difficulty hearing me or whatever throughout the presentation, just let one of us know, so we can avoid any issues. So, okay then, VCP6-CMA Section 4, configure and administer tenants and business groups. Before we get going, I'm just going to go over the individual sections of the tenants. So we've got Objective 4.1. We've got describe specific privilege levels for different business group roles, manage user roles, and this is referring to the user roles within a business group. Assign Active Directory users and groups to business group roles. Create and manage machine prefixes, and identify and configure custom properties. So for Objective 4.2, create and manage tenants, we've got configure branding for the vRealize automation console. Add and configure tenant-specific inbound and outbound email notifications. Override and revert system default email servers. Identify and add identity stores in VRA. And finally, create and assign user roles to an identity store group. Okay, so create and manage business groups. So we know that currently 3 roles exist within a business group. We've got the business group manager, the support user, and the business user. It's the job of the tenant administrator to assign these roles. And what I want to do is just go over each role in a little bit more detail. So business group managers, they can create and publish business group specific machine blueprints from IaaS. They can manage business group specific catalog items and entitlements. They can monitor resource usage in a business group. They can request and manage items on behalf of users in their groups. They can change ownerships of virtual machines, provisioned virtual machines within their groups. And support users, they can request and manage services just as a normal user can. The differentiating thing here is that they can change the ownership of the virtual machine, and they can request and manage items on behalf of other users within the business groups. The business user, they are just the standard user that comes along and consumes, the IT services that we provide to them via the service catalog. Once they've provisioned a resource from the service catalog, they're able to manage their own resource, obviously depending on what entitlements they've been given. So that brings us on to this slide, manage user roles. And what I'm actually going to do for this, though, I think, is just jump straight into the lab, rather than kind of talking you through these things. I think it's better to just get on and do it. So we'll just jump into the remote desktop session. And let's get going. Right, so for this, we'll need to log in as a tenant administrator. We'll head over to the infrastructure tab in the VRA console. head over to groups, then select business groups. And we'll wait for the Windows side of things to crank up a bit.
Windows sure is having a real good think about that, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is.
Is this your home lab?
No, it's sadly not my home lab. I don't have that in. It's not in the functional state at the moment. It's something I need to work on. Right, so now we have this. We shouldn't have to come back here again, so it's fine. We've got business group A already configured. So if we jump into there, and we'll have a look at the different roles, and we'll look at how we can add and remove users from each role. I'm hoping things are going to start to speed up a tiny little bit more than this as well. Excellent. So as I mentioned in the previous slides, we've got our three roles. We've got the business group manager role, as you can see, the support user role, and the user role. At the moment, I've got Active Directory groups configured in there. Each one of these contains the relevant users that you need to give permission. What I want to show you is that it's really simple actually to add users into these roles. You just have to type in the name of the user. So in this case, I'm going to use the business user. And you just search. And then, providing you've typed in your user correctly, you'll get a result. And obviously, the more specific you are with this search term, the less results you're going to get. In my case, I've only got one user called business user, and they have just popped up in the search results. So to add, you just click on the name, and it adds it to the list, either under what you've already got, or if you've not got anything in there, it will add it into the box. Removing users from these groups as well is as simple as highlighting the user or group that you have in there, and literally just pressing delete button on your keyboard. That clears that user from the box. Then you just click OK to save it. It's worth making a note while we're in here actually that you can see that there's 3 required fields for the business group. You only have to enter the name, you have to give it a default machine prefix, and you have to specify the manager email address. Nothing else is actually required to create the business group. And I want to highlight again that this is the job of the tenant administrator. So here we're logged in as tenant admin. Right, let's get back to the presentation. Actually, in fact, our next slide is actually assign Active Directory users and groups to the business group roles. While we're in here, we might as well go over that. This is exactly the same again. These two, the manage user roles objective and the assign Active Directory users and groups objective, to me they're quite similar. We're consuming an Active Directory identity store for this tenant, and all that we need to do to add users or groups that are in that identity store is again search for them using either the group name or the username. Again, if you want to trail down the amount of results you get back, be more specific with the search terms. You can even go as far as as put in the whole UPN in, which if you know your user, then it makes sense. So support user is an Active Directory user. We've just assigned that user now to the support role by literally searching. VRA goes and does its stuff searching the identity store. And what we're going to do now is just press OK to save the changes. And there you go. Right, let's head back to the slides and click on a little bit. So machine prefixes are next, and that's create and manage machine prefixes. So we know that the machine prefixes are used to generate names of provisioned machines in IaaS. The Fabric administrator actually creates these, and as a consequence, they're shared across all tenants. Every business group must have a default machine prefix assigned, as you've just seen. It was a required property. And also every blueprint must have a machine prefix assigned. This is an interesting one because you can either choose to use the business group default machine prefix, or you can actually set specific machine prefixes for your blueprints. So moving on from that, the tenant administrator, we know, assigns the machine prefixes to a business group. The tenant admin can also change the machine prefix assigned to a business group. And it's also possible for business group managers to choose different machine prefixes when they are creating their business group specific blueprint. So when you're creating machine prefixes, there are some constraints, if we can say, you must follow. So they must contain only ASCII letters, so that's A to Z. It's case insensitive. The digits 0 to 9 are supported, and obviously that includes hyphens. You can't begin with a hyphen. And you can have no other symbols, punctuation, or blank spaces in that. The machine prefixes themselves, this is including the whole of the name, so including the next number and the amount of digits you use. That's limited to 15 characters, which is, if you have one that's over 15 characters, it'll actually be truncated when you deploy the machine, and then what will happen is VRA will go and do a data collection, and then it will update the name, the truncated name, in the VRA console and database as a consequence. And I think the final point on this slide is probably, it's a bit obvious, but there's no support for multiple VMs with the same name in the same instance. So, I think the machine prefix handler will go off, and if it detects something with the same name, it will try and use the next one before it actually starts to fail. And again, if you're provisioning on the same vCenter platform, it goes without saying you can't start using the same VM names. Right, okay, it's lab time again. I think this topic is quite lab heavy, to be fair, but that's a good thing in my opinion. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a machine prefix just to demonstrate what we've just talked about. For this, we'll be logging in as the Fabric administrator. And what we'll do is we'll head over to the infrastructure tab. We'll go to blueprints and then machine prefixes. So you can see here that in tenant A, they already have a machine prefix for their development servers. Number of digits is 3 and the next number is 1. I'll just give you a quick, so the machine prefix is actually the identifier of the provision resource. So in our case it's dev-server hyphen. Number of digits, that basically is the number of digits that you include after the machine prefix, so the padding or the number of zeros that you're going to allow. And the next number, it can start from 0 I've started from 1 here, but basically that number will increment by 1 every time you deploy a new resource. So yeah, to add a new machine prefix, again, we're logged in as the Fabric administrator. We'll head over to new machine prefix, and then you're presented with your 3 required fields. So in this example, let's add a machine prefix for our production servers. So prod svr hyphen, we'll do 3 next digits, and we'll start next number at 1. To save that, just click on the green tick, and then that's saved. Deleting machine prefixes if you need to is simple as well. You just click on the delete button, which is the recycle bin. I think it might be worth mentioning as well that I don't think you can actually delete a machine prefix that's assigned anywhere, which is a good safety feature to sort of adhere to. Right, back to the slides. Okay, so identify and configure custom properties. We essentially use custom properties. This is lifted straight from the document to add new attributes or override default attributes. So, for example, if we think about if we want to start specifying a particular type of guest OS, customizing the virtual machine sort of system specifications in any way, number of disks. Another one is when you're specifying different system disks for the VM, you can choose to add a label to that, which gets passed down to the guest agent and configured in guest. Probably the most common one that I've seen is the Active Directory custom properties that enable AD object cleanup, in event of failure of the workflow or when you unprovision the machine. It's the job of the tenant administrator to configure custom properties when they're creating or editing business groups. Tenant administrators or business group managers can also configure custom properties when they create or edit blueprints. Again, this is probably the most common place to do it, and it's where you can begin adding build profiles, and you're consuming then sets of similar custom properties, that all adhere to a certain task. Fabric administrators, they can configure custom properties when they create or edit reservations. It's important to note that custom properties are retrieved or collated when the machine is provisioned. A lot of them will be used in build time. So you've got your network information. You have things like the host name, and as well, if you're configuring your NSX or VCNS security groups, you can specify those based on custom logic in your workflows as custom properties, and then push them back up to VRA before you hit the machine provision phase. The structure, they're key value pairs in a way. You'll most often see the custom.property.name sort of layout. So if we're looking at virtual machine.network.name or virtual machine.admin, whatever comes after that, you can mark custom properties as required. So this will mean that the user will be prompted to enter a value when they come to provision their machine. That's couples with actually the encrypted option. When you specify a custom property as encrypted, you'll be asked to enter the information twice, and it will be masked from view. The documentation says that it's encrypted in the database as well. I can't say that I know that for a fact. I'd be interested if anyone listening can actually confirm that one, because not all custom properties, to my knowledge, are actually stored in the database. So it's an interesting point, but I thought I'd pop it on there anyway, as the documentation does state that, and you know, it's a likelihood that you may get asked a question on it in the actual exam. As we mentioned earlier, similar custom properties can be grouped together in build profiles, which you then can configure or select when you configure in a blueprint even. It's up to the fabric administrator to define the build profiles. The fabric admin can also create property sets as well. I won't go into this too much because this actually is out of the scope of
subjective
section.
6.
Yeah, subjective 6, but just worth noting that the fabric administrator can create property sets. Basically, property sets can be added to build profiles there. It's another way of grouping together common custom properties and their values, you know. Build profiles, they're available to all blueprints and all business groups. And finally, a property specified in a blueprint overrides the same property specified in a selected build profile. So if we think on the lines of the Active Directory cleanup build profile, if we have default values configured in our build profile, let's say for example a username, but we want to override that username with another one that's going to be specific for our deployment, you can add that custom property into your blueprint as a custom property, and it will override the property set in the build profile. And at the bottom, it's just a sort of an image of what the custom properties actually look like when you specify them in VRA. Okay, so objective 4.2. Configure. So it's create and manage tenants, and the first slide is going to be about configuring branding for the VRA console. We know that it's the job of the system administrator to configure the default branding, which spans across all tenants, but the tenant administrator can actually override this with their own branding, and they can configure things like site logo, the background color, and the text color, and also the header and footer information. So that's things like your copyright and your help link. And I'll just quickly jump back into the lab. And just give you guys a quick example of this. So we'll log in as the tenant administrator. We'll head over to administration and branding. And you can see here that at the moment for this tenant, which is tenant A, use default is selected. So basically that means it's going to consume the branding that the system administrator has defined. If we deselect that, you'll notice that straight away the logo here that the system admins defined disappears. And what we can also do is begin to define our new branding. So if we give it a title, and we can also set a new background color to red. You can see that you actually have a live preview here as well, which is quite useful if you're trying to obtain a certain look without wiping out the current branding for all of the users. You can sort of begin to build your branding before you actually press update. So just to recap, we've unchecked use default. We've added a new background color, which is red. These are just the standard HTML hex colors that you can find anywhere. I've just grabbed one for red. I've left the text color as white. We've given it a product name, which is what you can see here, Tenant A, and we'll click update, and you should notice that when the page reloads, the branding has been applied. Cool. So we're going to be jumping pretty much straight back into a lab, but the next topic is add and configure tenant-specific inbound and outbound email notifications. So the system administrator actually, again, configures global inbound and outbound email servers. It's worth noting that only one of each can be configured, and that applies per tenant as well. So the tenant administrator can then go in and begin to configure tenant-specific inbound and outbound emails by choosing to override the global settings. Obviously, the next point down is a bit of a given, but I thought I'd put it anyway. You know, email servers, they're required to send and receive notifications. I've seen sometimes people ask, you know, why am I not receiving notifications from VRA? Well, it's because you haven't configured your SMTP server in there as an outbound server. Just mentioned that each tenant can only have one inbound and one outbound email server. Once that's configured, we can then start looking at the notification scenarios. This is again a per tenant thing, and it's up to the tenant administrator to jump in and do it. They'll just go into administration, notifications, then scenarios, and then what you can do is you can select the different scenarios you want to be notified for and activate them. They are all actually activated by default, so I think it's more of a case by going in and deciding which ones you don't want to be notified about. Users must also subscribe to these notifications. In VCP6, it wasn't a default option. Users weren't automatically subscribed to the notifications, and you had to go in per user, which I'll show you in a second, and subscribe. But now I can't remember what version it's from, but you as a user are automatically subscribed to any notification scenario that your tenant administrator sort of defines. Okay, so let's just jump back into the lab again. Okay, so we're already in as the tenant administrator, so I'm not going to log back out. But what we'll do is from the administration tab, we'll head over to notifications, and we'll have a look at the email servers first. So you can see here that we've got default email server specified. This has already been specified by the system administrator, and you'll notice that we can't do anything with it. And what you'll also notice is the inbound server has been configured specifically for this tenant. So if we jump in and have a look, and you can see that there's tenant-specific inbound email server options available here. Just going back out. So one of the points that I mentioned before is the ability to override global, and then obviously you need to be able to revert to the global ones. So if we look at the default outbound email server, to override the global, it's really simple. You just highlight whichever email server you want to override, and then select override global from the menu above, and then that straight away will give you you know, the form that you see when you specify the email server as the system administrator. So if we just quickly configure this as an example, so we want tenant A. Okay, So we've got the name, obviously, which is the description, or of the outbound server. So in this case it's tenant A outbound email, because that's that's the function of it. We give the server name, which is going to be your SMTP server address in this case. You can either choose to use SSL or TLS, or no encryption. So you've got port 25 for no encryption. TLS is port 587, and SSL is 465. It's worth noting that there is a difference between SSL and TLS, but again, it's kind of outside of the scope of this, but it's worth looking into if you don't know. You'll need to specify a sender address as well. Usually, you're not going to want replies. I always put no reply. And you can also finally, if you've got an encryption method specified, you can choose to accept self-signed certificates to avoid any errors. You'll see that if you select none, this actually becomes grayed out as well. So once you're happy with your the configuration of your new tenant-specific email server, you can choose to test the connection. I can't in this case because tenant A webmail doesn't exist in my environment, but what I'm going to do is just select add to give you an idea of what happens. So you can see now that we've just added tenant A outbound system, outbound email. The difference is that you can see, instead of seeing the default one, the tenant administrator, the system administrator, sorry, specified, you can now see our tenant A outbound email server, which is bold, and we can click into that and begin to reconfigure or view the settings. So if we wanted to revert to the global settings for whatever reason, again, it's as simple as highlighting the server that you want, and then you hit revert to global, and you're prompted, just hit yes, and you'll see that will switch straight back to the default one that we specified as the system administrator, and we'll do the same for the outbound email as well. Again, so we've hit revert to global, and then we will click yes. Okay, and that's wraps it up for email servers. Let's have a look at the scenarios while we're in here. So you can see, as I mentioned earlier on, that by default everything is active. It might be company policy to come in here and trim down things that you don't want to see. You might just want things going, your service catalog notifications just going to the managers, so therefore you only want the manager scenarios active. Sort of suspending these is as simple as highlighting what you don't want and then clicking suspend, and you'll notice the status here just on the right hand side changes to suspended. And again, if we don't want any of the release management stuff, you can actually you click and hold shift, click to where you want, and then you can choose to suspend them all. I mentioned also about users, it actually says here, to receive notifications, users must subscribe to notifications in their user preferences. The interesting thing is, as I say, in the later versions of VRA, it's actually a default setting now. I've already been in here and messed with this, but you'll find that if you go into your user, you'll see that the notification is actually set here, and it will be clicked as enabled. What I'll probably do is when we log in as another user later on, I'll just pop into the preferences and show you that. Let's jump back to the presentation. Okay, so identify and configure, identify and add identity stores in vRealize automation. So we've already sort of gathered that identity stores, they're there to authenticate users. When you create a tenant, each tenant you create must have at least one identity store, but more can be added if you need to. If you need to add more authentication sources, a later date if you want. So currently VRA supports 3 identity store types. You've got the native Active Directory. Now I've put it in bold here. This is only available for the default tenant. It will only work for the default tenant. You'll notice that when you go to configure identity stores in your other tenants that you create, you will not see that. You'll just see the Active Directory and the Open LDAP type in the drop-down box. Active Directory, this is going to just be your standard LDAP or LDAP-S, depending on what you're using, connection to AD. Deleting an identity store, it will remove the roles assigned to users from the store. It will also remove the roles assigned to users from the custom groups and any information about the services available to this user, but it will not affect entitlements and business groups. You can see on the right, this is an example of me adding a secondary identity store. Unfortunately, I can't do this as a demo because I don't have another AD domain to authenticate, so it will just fail if I try and add the same one. And in fact, actually, as a note, if you try and add another identity store with the same domain, it will know and it will fail and not let you. As a quick overview, as a tenant administrator, we'll go into the administration tab, we'll hit identity stores, then add. You'll give the identity store a name, select a type, and as I say, we're operating in a subtenant here, so we will only see the Active Directory and the Open LDAP identity store type available to us there. We'll configure the URL, so it's going to be LDAP or LDAP-S. So LDAP-S is port 389 by default. That's wrong, sorry. LDAP is port 389 by default, and LDAP-S is port 636 by default. You'll want to configure your domain. Domain alias is optional. This is, I guess, just a friendly name for your domain if you don't wish to show it to users. Your login DN. So this is the distinguished name of the Active Directory account that you're going to use to bind to your LDAP service with. As a point, there's nothing special about this account. It's literally just a user account that can authenticate to your domain, and therefore it can read the AD tree. You'll need a password for that user. You'll need to enter the group search base DN. In the example here, you can just see I've chosen to use the root of the domain, which it will just look, when you search for a user, it won't trail it down to any specific OU. It'll just search from the root of the domain down, so it will pick up anything. And the user search base DN is optional. So as a recap, we've only got 2 optional configuration parameters here, and that's domain alias and the user base DN. Everything else is mandatory. So I thought I'd include this as well because I think it's probably worth it, and it seems like a good piece of knowledge to have anyway. So some distinguished name examples. You can see the distinguished name is basically, it describes where this account lives in the directory exactly. You can see here I'm using a specific service account to bind to the directory, and I recommend that anyone follow this method if they're not already. It's just better for tracing if you have to. If you have to do any auditing on your domain controllers, at least you know that this service account is to do with your VRA identity store. So I mentioned before I was using just the domain root for my search-based DN. Underneath the second bullet point, you can see that this is an example of trailing it down to a specific set of OUs. So what we've actually got here is our root domain, but then we've got an OU called tenants, which then contains tenant A. And what I'm going to actually do, in fact, is I'll just go into AD in a second and show you this. Tenant A has multiple OUs underneath, but we only want to allow the search to search in the groups. So say if this was our group search based DN, we're only allowing VRA to do searches within tenant A's groups OU. These DN or distinguished name values can be found by using the attribute editor in Active Directory using computers, and then once you're in there, you want to be looking for the distinguished name attribute. I'm going to jump back into the lab really quickly and just show you this. So as an informational nugget, probably you'll need to, just by default when you go into Active Directory using computers, you won't be able to see the attribute editor. You'll need to come up to View and you'll need to enable the advanced features, and you'll notice that the actual tree looks different when you do that. So if we go back and enable that, you'll see that there are a few more containers that appear. So as per the example that I've just shown, you'll see that we've got our root domain, then we've got the tenants folder. Within the tenants folder, you've got tenant A's folder. And then so we've got the OU for tenant A, and then we want the DN, the distinguished name for the group's OU. So, you know, we're telling our identity store, don't search anywhere other than tenant A's group's OU. So we'll right click on that OU, we'll go to properties, and then we'll hit the attribute editor tab. And then you'll see here the distinguished name, and this is the exact value that you want to be pasting into your identity store. Most will probably know this exists already, but I thought I'd include it, you know, just on the off chance that there's one person that you know this helps out. Jump back to the presentation. Cool. So create and assign users, create and assign user roles even to an identity store group. So I'm going to jump back into the lab actually for this because it's going to be easier to show you guys. It's the job of the tenant administrator. We're going to be in the administration tab again, and we're going to be using some of the groups that we've specified in our identity store. So let me log back in. So we're still the tenant administrator, which is good. So we're on the administration tab again in the VRA web console, and we'll head over to users and groups, and we'll head over to identity store users and groups, and what you'll see is nothing at the moment until we search. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to search for the business users group, which is an Active Directory group in our identity store for this tenant. So we'll click on the business group. So what you have is you have the add roles for this group, sort of list of roles. And what I'm going to do for this example is select business users. I'm going to assign them to the service architect role. This little window down here, the authorities granted by selected roles list, it's actually quite useful if you have to justify to anybody what roles that you know this group will have as a result of anything you've selected above. It lists everything here, so you can see if we were to select tenant administrator, we've got a whole load of other stuff that pops up. But for this example, I'm just going to concentrate on service architect. So as an addition to well, from nothing to service architect, our business users group get access to the tenant administration GUI. They can create and publish advanced services using ASD. They can create, update and publish services, catalog items and actions shared across a tenant, and they can also import and export ASD content. So you can go through the business users group as well from in here to check out different bits of information that are custom. So in here we're able to see that the business users groups, they're a basic user of business group A. Currently they have nothing entitled. If we head back to the details tab. So just to recap, we've assigned the service architect role to the business user group, and what we're going to do is update, log out, and we'll log in as business user, who is a member of the business users group. And what we should see is now this business user, who was a standard user before, now has access to the advanced services tab, and we can begin to start building our advanced service blueprints, defining custom resources, and adding any extra resource actions to those that we want. Okay. Yeah, as a final point on that, users, they must log in and log out and log back in once you. So if you assign the service architect role to the business group, the business user group, that won't be effective immediately. In order to see the advanced services tab, they'll need to log out of the VRA console and log back in before the new permissions are effective. Cool. We've just done that demo. Cool. I think that wraps us up. I'll make this available after the broadcast is finished, but I mean, this is just a list of resources that I used for this topic when I was studying for the exam. A lot of the information is in the VMware documents. There was a really cool video that was done by vBrownBag on custom properties, and then you've got two fairly good videos that have been put out there by actual VMware themselves about business group and user management, and also tenant management, which actually gives a lot of the information too. So if going from the resources here, you can't really go wrong with this topic. Short and sweet it was, which is good. Cool. So thank you very much for listening to me. It's been a pleasure presenting.
Thank you very much, Craig. Has anyone got any questions for Craig at all about any of the content, or anything vaguely related to it? Feel free to raise your hands, ask a question through the tool or via Twitter. I'll give you just a couple of seconds to get those in. As Craig mentioned, we'll put the slide deck up, and the video will also go up on the VBrownBag site in the next day or so, and be available to watch as a podcast shortly thereafter. Not seeing any questions at the moment, so I think I can't think of any questions off the top of my head. You seem to cover it all.
It's quite. I mean, it's a nice section, isn't it? To really go over. Everything is to the point with it, which is what I like about it.
Yeah, so some of the other sections are a little bit. I wouldn't say vague, but there's
interesting.
There's a lot to cover, and I think there's quite a wide range of information in some of the other topics. So it'd be interesting when they come up.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, as we've got no questions, I'm going to stop the recording there. Thank you very much indeed. Hopefully we'll have Objective 5 next week.
Cool.
And thank you very much, Craig.
All right, thanks, guys.